If your highest goal was to produce as much food out of the ground as possible, then you would probably begin with a tractor. Why a tractor? Well, it's simply the best option you have towards your goal. You could use a horse-drawn plow, and you could certainly make some food. You could even go out into the field and use your bare hands to dig soil for planting. But these methods would be slow and hard on your body, reducing the amount of overall food you could produce given your limited lifespan. It's not that the horse-drawn plow or even your hands wouldn't produce food. They surely would produce some, perhaps even an impressive amount, but it would fall short of your goal, which is to produce the greatest amount of food possible. Indeed, if you were to use a horse-drawn plow while knowing about tractors, then it would be a sin against your goal. You would clearly be using the horse-drawn plow because you like horses, or perhaps you like the harder work, or maybe you simply dislike tractors for some reason. Regardless, it would be you subjugating the goal of producing the most food to your own wants and desires. Therefore, you must use a tractor to produce the most food. But notice, this does not imply that someone else who has never heard of a tractor, and instead only knows of horse-drawn plows as the best way to make the most amount of food, is in no way wrong, even though they're in a state of lower knowledge than you. So you cannot reasonably go to them and declare their use of the horse-drawn plow to be a sin simply because it's a sin for you with your knowledge of tractors. Instead, you must first bring them the good news about tractors. Tractors produce more food than horse-drawn plows. Thus, if their goal really is to produce the most food, they will indeed find it good news that a better method of producing food has been discovered, and so they will discard their plow, perhaps slowly as to not botch their current harvest, and soon be seeking out knowledge of tractors for themselves so they too might make the most amount of food given this new understanding. But their goal, which is to make the most food, never changed at all. However, if they refuse to change to tractors when shown their better food production, then it can be understood that they never really had the goal of making food, but rather simply loved their horse-drawn plow. Notice also that it might be that some people who are using tractors don't have the goal of making the most food, but rather just enjoy and find pleasure in tractors. They too will be right out there with you in the field, driving a tractor and doing so eagerly. However, once it comes time to put away the tractor, they will fall to the same problem as those who loved the horse-drawn plow, and will cling to their tractor even after the improved hover tractor is invented. This too reveals that they never had the goal of producing the most food possible, but rather were simply out in the field for the love of driving tractors. Thus we can look around at all the other methods for producing the most food, the plow, the hoe, the hand, and many others, and see that one clearly produces the most food, but only for us personally. There's no magic going on here. You might say that the person who discovered or invented the tractor only achieved it from some higher source, perhaps their own genius or divine revelation or even pure coincidence. But unless that source is revealed to you, then it doesn't really matter. Not to your main goal, which is to produce as much food as possible. So long as tractors produce the most food, then that's all you need to start producing. Now, if you're not convinced of the efficacy of a tractor for producing food, then you should indeed be working to figure out the best method for producing food. You surely can't produce food without a method, but you also can't judge a method if you aren't already trying to produce food. After all, without an experience, you would have nothing against which to judge anything you observed. So all food-producing effort must begin with a leap of faith if it's to begin at all. You might trust the word of someone that a tractor is better than a horse-drawn plow, or vice versa, but until you actually get out and try to produce as much food as you can, there's no way to tell what method will produce the most food. Some people who have never made any dedicated effort to produce the most food they can want to talk about the best method for producing food without ever having actually tried any method at all. In doing so, they reveal that they don't actually care about how much food is produced, but rather just want to feel like they're participating. After all, producing food takes months and years, but just because someone has hopped on a tractor and found the rumble and smoke to be displeasing in no way means they are an authority on how much food a tractor can produce. You see this all the time, people making arguments that tractors produce smoke and noise and do nothing to prevent sunburn while out in the field, which is certainly true, but the fact remains that tractors are obviously the best method for producing the most amount of food, and the only ones who disagree aren't making any effort to produce food at all. In fact, it looks like they're arguing against the use of tractors in order to get out of having to do the labor of producing food themselves. Now, this is not to say there's not argumentation going on within the farming community. Some will argue that a defining feature of a tractor is a large, powerful motor, while others insist that a tractor should be defined by the quality of its tires. But if you look into the matter, you find that those who propose tractors with powerful motors are working in fields of dense, compacted soil, which requires a lot of power to plow through, whereas those who demand good tires are working in muddy, wet soil, which requires good tires not to get bogged down and stuck. Thus, each party is correct in their assertion because their brand of tractor works in the soil they're trying to work. But each is wrong trying to make those with different soil use a different tractor. They all share the same goal of producing the most food, even as they improperly try to help each other using their own observations of what works best in their field. However, there are some who can be seen to not be trying to grow the most food. Those who argue about the color of tractors can be seen to have no reason behind their assertions. The color of the tractor has no observable effect on how much food it produces. Because of this, those who argue passionately about the color of tractor paint can be seen to simply enjoy being part of the debate. Perhaps they just like certain colors of paint, or maybe they're hoping to convince others to listen to them to gain some sort of authority they can then abuse. Regardless of their exact motives, it's clear that their main goal was never about producing the most food possible. When that fact is discovered, they are then removed from the discussion entirely. But from this, another problem appeared. Those who are called the number fixers. As those who wished to produce the most food began to judge which methods were not producing, some began to fixate on their production numbers, wishing to appear as though they had the most food production, and so they would farm as best they could, but once they reached the limit of their fields, they would go around and begin to purchase as much food as they could from other farmers, bringing it back to their farm and adding it to the total they claimed to have produced. Their record numbers gaining them great acclaim from the food-producing community, who listened to all they had to say, eager to learn their methods and copy them to produce yet more food. But a problem arose when the methods used by these number fixers simply wouldn't produce the same crop yield for anyone else who tried them. This created great confusion, and a large amount of resources was poured into trying to figure out what was different about the fields and tractors of the number fixers, when in fact there was nothing different at all. In time, the secret of their fudged numbers was revealed simply because all the other possibilities were ruled out, but not without great expense which could have otherwise gone to producing more food in the world. Because of this, many criticize the farmers as being a corrupt industry which produced little to nothing and simply fixes its numbers to make it appear as though something of value has been produced. Some number fixers became so successful at this as to find it easier to not produce any food at all, but rather to just buy up vast amounts of food and then claim to have produced it, making their money from selling books and seminars on how they grew so much food. And so those whose goal was to produce the most food in the world are forced to use a great amount of their time working to weed out the false producers and defend the reputation of food growers as a whole. But the damage is done. Entire groups of people these days don't even consider that food comes from food growers at all, but rather can be found only in the large food storage warehouses that are still mostly full of food. Any thought that those food warehouses had to have been filled up with food from somewhere in the past is scoffed at, and it is often assumed that because the warehouses were so very large that the food stores there will never really run out. The idea that it was food producers who originally filled those warehouses in the past is mocked, and fingers are pointed at those who have been revealed to be number fixers, producing no food at all, but rather buying food and then claiming to have produced it. And so yet more resources must be turned away from the production of food and focused instead on trying to convince people that food must be grown in order to exist in the world, and that if we wish for food to not run out, they must contribute to its growth in whatever way they are able. In more recent years, the effects of this doubt has become rampant. New industries have developed a drug in the form of a pill. They declare it is the solution to the problem of food because it circumvents the entire need for food by reaching the same end goal, which is to satisfy hunger. People walk the streets thin and starving, but force themselves to smile as they try to convince themselves that the pill is working. Sure, it stops the hunger from gnawing, but but it does nothing for the muscle aches from lack of protein, nor for the exhaustion from the lack of calories. Though in response to those side effects, yet more pills are developed which dull the pain and the aches, and which stimulate the body with a feeling of false energy. But it doesn't stop the breakdown of their bodies. Though they may not feel the pain, the weakness of their grip leaves them struggling to open doors. Even so, they claim to not need food at all, that these pills give them freedom like never before. The food itself was never real or needed at all, though in reality, they say this to get out of the burden of having to toil in the fields and produce food in the first place. Though those whose goal it is to produce the most food spend great efforts to convince these people of their error, some simply do not listen and waste away to nothing, convinced, even to their last breath, that food is unnecessary. The most damning part of the whole thing is that it can clearly be seen that those who produce the hunger-removing pills themselves do not take the pills. Rather, they just eat food. The problems don't end there, however. There was a group, often called artificial farmers, who claimed that the best way to grow as much food as possible was to modify the food using technology. They began to apply ritualized methods of increasing the amount of food produced. They added chemicals to the soil that swelled the produce. They injected the fruits with substances that made them enlarge like never before. They even modified the seeds, turning off the genes that limit the fruit's growth. Anything they discovered increases the size of the fruit they employed. And indeed, the fruits and vegetables they produced became massive and bulging. But a problem emerged in the produce. Though a vast amount was produced, the quality of the fruit was poor. It lacked hardly any nutrients, and the chemicals seeped into the flesh of the plants, making it toxic for humans to consume. Those who ate it became terribly sick. The more traditional farmers criticized the methods and warned that what had been created can't even be called food anymore. But rather than abandon their system of modified produce, this group of farmers told people that there's no problem with the food, but rather the problem was with their mouths and stomachs being unable to properly ingest this new and improved crop. If people would just modify their bodies, they would be able to eat the toxic food. So they began to apply their technology to their own bodies, modifying their mouths and stomachs with artificial machines that allowed them to ingest the toxic plant matter. When they found the intestines struggled to deal with what the artificial stomach digested, they replaced those too, followed by the liver and kidneys, and soon the blood itself was being drained and replaced with a more optimized substance that could handle the effects of the toxic digestion process. The more traditional food producers criticized these methods too, warning that what those artificial farmers were doing defeated the whole purpose of producing food. But the farmers argued back that the concept of food wasn't real, that instead what really needed to change was the human body, and that if a person's brain cannot see the value in modifying their digestive organs, then the brain too needed to be modified. And so these artificial farmers began to push the idea that the human brain itself had to be replaced with more reasonable and logical machines which could see the value in optimizing around the optimized digestive systems, which themselves built around the optimized toxic food which could be produced in vast quantities. Once their brains had been replaced with logic engines, such farmers are able to dedicate themselves fully over to keeping the production of food optimized, their new bodies affording them incredible output of their toxic fruit yields. But as they toiled, they deduced that the production of food could be fully optimized if there was no need for the energy by stopping anything that used energy. And so, in order to create perfect optimization, the farmers determined that the best way to maximize food was to not need food at all. And so, they all shut their artificial minds off to save energy. No longer needing calories, they no longer needed to grow any food at all. No food was plenty. And so the artificial farmers movement came to an end. Another group, often called the chaos farmers, claimed that in order to grow as much food as possible, they needed to improve the food, not through artificial methods, but through the most natural means. They claimed that traditional food crops were too varied and inconsistent, that the struggle with different types of soil being required for different crops was a terrible burden, and so a more functional crop was needed. A crop that could grow in any soil and which had a perfectly balanced combination of all nutrients a food should contain, all while tasting delicious. They proposed the perfect fruit. They spoke about it in reverence, a single crop which contained all the benefits of every known foodstuff and none of the drawbacks, the most delicious food mankind would ever taste, the last fruit mankind would ever need, the perfect fruit. The Chaos Farmers formed a plan on how to get there. Every plant ever made got to where it was through adaptation over time. Given enough time, the perfect fruit would eventually evolve all on its own. The Chaos Farmers claimed we just needed to speed that natural process up a bit, and so they began chaos farming. They began by modifying their fields, mixing every possible environment together. Patches of fertile dirt, some tilled and some not, clumps of wet marshy ground just beside strips of dry sand, stretches of clay and silt strewn in haphazardly, and into each of these regions was planted all manner of crops, some edible and some wild, some in their proper environment, but most in an alien world they weren't designed for. Tangled briars intermixed with tall grasses which competed for light against cornstalks, vines ensnared bamboo shoots which snuffed out upcoming hardwood trees. Along the floor, moss formed in clumps in wet spots where seaweed and rice plants bumped shoulders in salty puddles. Mushrooms of every color grew along the trunks of malformed trees that had fallen over and begun to rot. Venus flytraps bit at the petals of roses, and cacti stabbed through the fruits of strawberry and onion plants. Most plants never germinated out of their seeds. Those that survived struggled and quickly died. But the Chaos Farmers worked diligently to replant everything that didn't last, striving to keep a balance and use the chaotic life and death to simulate new and unseen forms of plant life, never judging if something was edible or not. Their goal to keep everything in chaos and let the plants mingle and merge in whatever way they pleased. New species popped up with every passing season, only to be snuffed out again by another adaptation from its competition. The Chaos Farmers, confident that given enough time, eventually the perfect fruit would appear out of the chaos. But the progress was too slow, and the upkeep of these fields of chaos was expensive. They had to be tended at all times and produced very little produce that could be sold for profit. Funds were drying up, their fields overflowing with increasingly exotic and mutated plant life, ever expanding and in danger of collapsing. The perfect fruit was not appearing out of the chaos. More money and land was needed for the search for the perfect fruit to continue. And so the Chaos Farmers began to urge others to join them, preaching of the perfect fruit and how glorious it would be once realized. Anyone who would not contribute their wealth or land was shamed and scorned by the Chaos Farmers. Accusations of being an enemy of the perfect fruit were levied. They coerced and even threatened other farmers to join them, demanding more and more land be dedicated to the pursuit of the perfect fruit. But as the harvest came and went, with an ever-increasing amount of farmland being dedicated to chaos farming, which produced nothing of value, people began to get hungry. Fields that once produced staple crops now produced only unstable jungles of vegetation never before seen. The hunger of the bellies of the people overtook the promises of the perfect fruit, and the people began to hate the chaos that was consuming their food. As starvation loomed, the people gathered together in a mob and set fire to the chaos fields one by one, burning every plant to ashes and driving out the Chaos Farmers, who have not been seen since. But to this day, anyone who suggests chaos farming is quickly shamed and silenced for even suggesting it. All of this reveals a certain truth about the production of food. Not even those whose true goal is to produce as much food as possible can easily discern the motives of another person who shares that goal. Such discernment takes time, but the structures around food production are exactly what you would expect to see. They would join together in order to share knowledge about how to produce the most food, but they would each have their own attuned methods, which must be rejected by any food producer in too different a situation. They would welcome anyone who claimed to desire to produce the most food, but would be on guard for liars and would have methods to protect their efforts. They would consider their methods superior, even while accepting that other methods may be valid for other people. They would desire progress towards improvement even while denying anything which has not been properly tested. The details of food production will be both a matter of utmost importance and at the same time a subjective thing which need not be quibbled about so long as the core goals of maximizing food production is maintained. The holding out for hope that one day food production methods will be made perfect would be paramount in their fantasies, but even so they would value the respecting of the reality that if we ever hope to get there, food enough must be made to allow us to reach that future. These are the realities we must deal with if we're to have any hope of producing the most food possible. So stay strong in the fields, and endure labor with diligence and patience. Do not hate those who would interfere with your crops, but do not allow them to destroy the yield. Always do what produces the most possible food.